Welcome! Contrary to popular belief, the US does not technically use the imperial system. The United States customary system of measurements and the British imperial measurement system differ slightly. Both are based on the same traditional measurements, but each country created their own set of definitions in the early 1800s, and they are slightly different. For instance, an imperial pint is equal to 1.2 US liquid pints. Also, the US doesn't use stone as a measurement. We prefer our stones cold. There was a general sentiment in early America that we needed to be different from Europeans. This sentiment has played a role in many of the little cultural differences between Americans and Europeans. Another instance of this is Noah Webster, as in the dictionary, was part of a movement to differentiate American English from British English by simplifying it. This is why color doesn't have a U in it in the US. Now let's break down where all these measurements came from. Ounces and pounds come from the avoirdupois system of measurements. The word avoirdupois comes from the Anglo-Norman French phrase for goods of weight and is loosely based on measurements the Romans used. However, it was turned into the system we use today by one of the most powerful groups in the world during the 13th century. That's right, it was created by Big Wool. You see, wool sellers needed a standardized unit of measure to simplify transactions. Part of this was deciding that there should be 16 ounces in a pound, despite the word ounce coming from the Latin word uncia, which means 1/12. They did this because it was useful for the unit to have more divisors. But where did tons come from, you ask? It comes from another powerful group, winemakers. A ton, spelled T-U-N, is a cask of wine that contains around 250 gallons of wine. These tons weigh around 2,000 pounds, hence the name. The gallon used by the US was also created by winemakers. It was originally called the wine gallon, and supposedly is based on the volume of 8 pounds of wine. There were also corn gallons and ale gallons that were different sizes. It was then split into quarters to become quarts. Then half of a quart is a pint. And we don't know where pint comes from, but the main theory I've seen is that it refers to the painted measure lines on containers. Another word that came from uncia is inch. It was originally 1/12 of the Roman measurement pes, which means foot. The easiest way to measure a distance is to count your steps between the 2 points, so that's what everyone used. A pes was the length of a foot. There was also the Roman measurement called passus, meaning pace. That was 5 Roman feet. The Roman equivalent of a mile was called the millipassus, meaning 1,000 paces. So 5,000 feet. This logical number was ruined by none other than the same dastardly textile industry. In the 1500s, the English passed several laws that included changing standard measurements. This included shortening the length of inches, feet, and yards, whose name comes from an old English word for a stick or rod used to measure lengths of cloth, and this was done in an effort to regulate the cloth industry. They realized that changing those measurements would also change the measurements used for measuring property for taxes. They then passed a rule to make measurements associated with land stay the same length they were with the previous foot and yard measurements. This led to the mile going from 5,000 feet to 5,280 feet. It also fixed changes to the furlong, which was based on how long a team of oxen could plow without resting. It also reverted the size of an acre, which was based on how much land a man and a team of oxen could plow in a day. It was measured at the time as a furlong long and 4 rods wide. A rod was how long the prod used on an ox was. Today, the acre is just measured in square feet, since the only people that use the furlong still are horse race announcers. So why does the US still use all this stuff? Well, the anti-metric movement in the US was popularized by a man named Charles Latimer, who started the International Institute for Preserving and Perfecting Weights and Measures. He thought that the metric system would lead to atheism, because it came from the godless French. He also thought that the inch and other American measurements were tied to the Great Pyramid of Giza, which he thought was created by the Christian God. I often like to point out that we haven't changed much over the course of human history. If Charles Latimer was alive today, he would definitely be on TikTok telling people, "The mesas are trees cut down by giants!" or whatever else the people who've been failed by the mental health system are saying these days. Jimmy Carter also tried to convert the US to the metric system in the 70s, but Reagan reversed it mostly out of spite. Till recently, there was actually a road sign near Santa Fe, New Mexico that displayed distances in kilometers due to this brief metric period. Despite all this resistance, the US customary measures now have definitions based on conversions to their metric equivalent. This first happened in 1893 to better facilitate trade under the Mendenhall Order, and has been further expanded over time. Also, many Americans use the metric system for their profession, ranging from nurses to mechanics. The last part of this video is going to be about another set of US customary measurements that were popularized after that order, though. Cups, teaspoons, and tablespoons are the de facto measurements in the US for cooking instead of measuring by weight like the rest of the world. What caused this difference? Well, if you look at cookbooks from before the late 1800s, they are filled with nonsense measurements. It's all pinches of this, smidgens of that, and pieces of butter the size of an egg. A big reason for this was that in this time period, a scale with small enough tolerances to measure the amount of cinnamon to put into a cake was very expensive. They could easily cost the equivalent of a few $1,000s today. This made them unobtainable for most Americans, especially in the western part of the US where many people were subsistence farmers. Scales were largely reserved for people like store owners who needed them for work. There were a number of measurements being put forward at this time to try and solve this problem. This is where the Boston Cooking School comes in. You see, this school was set up in 1879 to help women who wanted to learn to cook as a trade or to better care for their families. The recipes taught there would use cups, tablespoons, and teaspoons as measurements, but they were not quite the same standardized measurements that we use today. The idea was that if you used the same cup and spoons for all of your measurements, you would have roughly the right ratio of ingredients. There were other similar measurements being used at the time, like a coffee cup, a teacup, or a dessert spoon. You may be wondering why this system used at the Boston Cooking School is what won out. Well, in 1889, the Boston Cooking School asked one of their top students to stay on as a teacher after she graduated. By 1891, she had become the school's principal. Her name was Fannie Farmer. Fannie Farmer took the logical and scientifically based methods taught at the school and further refined them. This included teaching that when you measure, you should scrape a knife over the top of the cup or spoon to level it off, to ensure consistent measurements. This is how she got her nickname, the Mother of Level Measurements. You may be wondering how a teacher in Boston had this big of an effect on the country. Well, in 1896, Fannie Farmer released her book called the Boston Cooking School Cookbook. Originally, the publisher made her pay for the 3,000 copies they printed because they doubted the success of her 567-page cookbook. They were wrong. The book sold hundreds of thousands of copies during her lifetime and has sold more than 7 million copies to date. It became the go-to cookbook in America. In the early 20th century, it was one of the most common wedding gifts in the US. It's not just a normal cookbook. She explains everything from what a starch is to how to build a fire. It was also updated over time. Since it's in the public domain, I linked a PDF hosted on the Internet Archive of the 1918 edition of the book that includes recipes to deal with wartime rationing. On page 25, the book says, "Correct measurements are absolutely necessary to ensure the best results. Good judgment with experience has taught some to measure by sight, but the majority need definite guidelines. Tin, graniteware, and glass measuring cups divided into quarters or thirds holding 1/2 pint, and tea and tablespoons of regulation sizes, which may be bought at any store where kitchen furnishings are sold, and a case knife are essentials for correct measurement. Mixing spoons, which are a little larger than tablespoons, should not be confounded with the latter." Her definition of a cup has held true since. Also, thanks to her book's popularity, the measuring cup she described became a regularly sold item in the US. The regulation-sized spoons refer to the fact that a teaspoon is customarily 1/3 as big as the tablespoon in a set. By the way, when you see teaspoons listed now on labels in the US, they are usually using the metric teaspoon, which is 5 milliliters. The US customary teaspoon is 1/6 of a fluid ounce, or 4.92 milliliters. Also, the cookbook is still pretty useful. It's not like those weird 50s recipes where it's telling you to put canned tuna in lime jello. Some of the recipes are not common anymore, there's a lot of hollandaise sauce, but they are still generally good. She has recipes for everything from ice cream to curry. This is part of why revised editions are still widely sold today. The only thing that is a bit different is that in older versions like I linked, it tends to say things like bake until firm or bake until brown instead of 350 Fahrenheit for 12 minutes because she assumed you were cooking on a wood-fired stove. This book laid the groundwork for how cooking is taught and recipes are written in the United States. Her science-based teaching style is also very similar to that of modern chefs like Alton Brown. Even though nowadays digital scales are pretty cheap, American bakers still tend to use cups and spoons because they learned from their mom, who learned from her mom, who learned from her mom, that learned how to write down a recipe from Fannie Farmer. That's all I have for you. Subscribe, follow me on Instagram for rat pictures, and have a great day and eat something good.